In my last segment, where I talked about the pandemic and previous plans to combat COVID, I ended that segment talking about the various ways that the Trump administration made a really super horrendously difficult situation for the American people that much worse. But I have a question that I want to pose to you. As bad of a situation as we had under President Trump, and considering what President Biden has inherited, particularly as it relates to one of the things that I mentioned at the end of the last segment, which was the lack of an effective vaccine distribution strategy from the Trump administration, the question I pose to you is, did President Biden actually hit the ground running with COVID? And I want you to kind of expand your factual considerations beyond just the last segment. If you've listened to other podcast episodes that I've talked about, not so much focused on the health strategy, which is kind of what I just mentioned, but just on a broader kind of response to COVID, but probably a little bit more specifically the economic side of it. Again, did President Biden actually hit the ground running? Consider all that stuff in trying to formulate an answer to that question. Now, I do want to be fair. Like, let me start off by being totally fair. A lot of people may say that I'm not fair to COVID in chief. Who is that? That is what I refer to as, or who I refer to when I'm referring to Donald Trump, President COVID in chief. But I do want to, in all sincerity, be super fair to President Biden. He absolutely, as was talked about in the previous segment, he did inherit, as it retains or pertains to the vaccine strategy that he got from President Trump. He got like just a dumpster fire of a situation, right? The vaccine distribution strategy was essentially non-existent. And I want you to remember what I said earlier. Not only did President Trump not have an effective vaccine distribution strategy, that contributed to some of the problems, many of the problems that we had been having, whether you're talking deaths, whether you're talking diagnoses, or even on the economic level. That in and of itself contributed to a lot of the problems that we were facing as a nation in our, and I'm using air quotes here, efforts to combat COVID under the Trump administration. So let's get away from the health aspect. Again, I know I just mentioned the lack of a vaccine strategy, and I will totally give that to President Biden. But looking at the economic side of this, right? Because this isn't just a one-sided issue. Prior to President Biden and his American Rescue Plan, we had two forms of economic relief for the American people. You had the CARES Act that was back in March, if you remember that. We also had the Consolidated Appropriations Act 2021, which is what we saw back here in December. Now, both of those, the CARES Act and the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, both of those were signed into law under COVID in chief, Donald Trump, right? Let me be respectful here, President COVID in chief, President Donald Trump. Now, do you remember when President Trump, COVID in chief, said that he supported direct payments of $2,000 to the American people? Think about it for a second. If you do remember that, there probably was also something else that you remember that was a little bit weird at the time. There was this kind of like almost weird alliance between Trump, COVID in chief, and then President-elect Joe Biden and the Democrats. Like, they were actually all in support of $2,000 as a direct stimulus payment. Now, why in the world with these three groups, be on the same page. Like, they are political foes to the umpteenth power. Well, at the time, again, we're talking after the general election, we had the Georgia Senate special election that happened in December because of, the runoffs between Ossoff, Warnock, Loeffler, and Perdue. Not all like at the same time, but you get what I'm talking about. And when you look at the Democrats and Biden, what they wanted out of their efforts to support $2,000, they wanted, understanding the makeup of the Senate as it was at that time, given the elections that just occurred on the 4th, they wanted a way to swing political control in their favor by essentially having a 50-50 split in the Senate and then having the vice president be in the position where she, is the tie-breaking vote. We've actually already seen that come to fruition with the recent vote that I had mentioned on a previous episode. But if you don't know what I'm talking about, go back and take a listen to it. So that is what those two parties wanted out of it, because the Democrats and Biden did not necessarily want the same thing out of Trump. Out of supporting the $2,000 that Trump did. COVID in chief, Trump, he at the same time, he did also want to have a way to keep control of the Senate, because in the 116th Congress, the Senate was completely controlled by Republicans. And as part of that control, the majority leader, Mitch McConnell, was able to essentially keep really any and everything from even being brought up for a vote, which is why last congressional session, the Senate was like super, super lazy. Like, it did nothing, right? It was completely just ineffective, right? But so he wanted that. But in addition to that, what COVID in chief also wanted was he wanted to create a situation where if he bucked against what his party wanted, his party either wanted $600 or nada for the American people. If he bucked against them and said, I'm willing to support $2,000, he understood the type of political capital that would create for him. It essentially would look favorable on him and his future political escapades, runnings, whatever you want to call it, if he was able to come back in some future kind of time and say, I supported $2,000 for the American people, right? So he understood that, something that, quite frankly, to this day, I don't understand. Well, you know what? I'm not going to say I don't understand why people who didn't support it didn't, especially when they could have understood what it would have done for them, not just their party, Republicans in the Senate, but I don't understand how. Well, I do understand that it would have impacted people who weren't even in the Senate, if they were willing to support it. But I understand why that happened. It all goes back to campaign finance, but that is another subject for another day. So ultimately, getting back to this $2,000, why did we not see, and I'm going somewhere with this, I promise you, I'm tying this all in to answering our question of, did President Biden actually hit the ground running as it relates to COVID? But when we go back and we look at this $2,000, we know, you and I both know, we did not get $2,000. The American people in December were not given $2,000 as part of the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021. Americans ended up getting $600. Why in the world did that happen? Well, then Senate Majority Leader, or as some call him, Turtle, Mitch McConnell, he blocked the bill. How did he block the bill? He didn't let it come up for a vote. This goes back to you understanding how a bill becomes a law, right? Both chambers have to agree to pass essentially the same piece of legislation. The House had passed it. The Senate didn't. Not only did they not pass it, they didn't even take a vote on it. Okay. And when you had senators such as Bernie Sanders who were willing to put it all on the line and say, you know what, I'm going to demand that we vote, he essentially was smacked down and not allowed to vote. But anywho, so Mitch McConnell, Turtle, he did not allow it to come up for a vote. He blocked the bill. This is, quite frankly, why he has, and it's not the only reason, there are many reasons, but this is one of the main reasons why people who didn't know who he was before, like, found out who he is and totally developed a mass amount or level of disdain for the man. But even people who knew of him before politically really didn't take too kindly for him. Do you know what his nickname is? The Grim Reaper. Not because he's out there killing people, and you might beg to differ with his support of the recent insurrection, but it's because he kills legislation. He does not let it come up for a vote. Like, that has to be deeply troubling. And it should be deeply troubling, not just to Americans en masse, but specifically to his constituents, especially those who would benefit from a lot of legislation that he either votes down or does not allow to come up for a vote. And then that can totally lead you into another conversation about what's going on, not just in his local constituency, but across the country in efforts to keep people from actually being able to vote. But getting back to Mitch, he has this low approval rating. And again, when you consider how and why the Grim Reaper has a low approval rating, like, it's absolutely no question. So I've gone off on a tangent, as I'm typically known for doing. So let me bring this back to President Biden. I pose the question again. Did President Biden hit the ground running with COVID? I don't know what you would say, and I'm not going to tell you what I personally say, but I will tell you what a lot of other people are actually saying as an answer to that question. A lot of people are saying, no, President Biden did not hit the ground running with COVID. Why in the world, especially Brittany, when you talked about he had this horrible vaccine strategy, when you talked about how bad things were, when you talked about how President Trump did such a horrible job, anything was better than what we had before, why in the world are so many people under the impression that President Biden did not hit the ground, and in a lot of ways, he has let them down in his response to COVID? Well, let's go back to Georgia. Before the Georgia Senate runoffs, after, okay, keep in mind, just in case you kind of can't put together a timeline, because I understand I've kind of jumped around to a lot of different places. When we go to the Georgia Senate runoffs, this was after President Biden, then president-elect, had already been declared the winner of the presidential election, okay? During this time, President Biden said that he would support direct payments of $2,000, and he promised, this is the key here, he promised that if John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, the two Democrats who were running in Georgia during that runoff election, he promised, you deliver these two, you win their seats, you vote them in, you will get a $2,000 check. He didn't say you'd get $1,400. You would get $600 minus the $1,200 you had before. So we'll really only give you $200. He didn't say any of that. He said you would get a $2,000 checks. You give us X, we will give you Y. I promise. We didn't think that he had his hands behind his back, crossing his fingers, potentially crossing his toes, crossing his eyes. We thought that he was being on the up and up with us. At the end of the day, Georgians delivered. Ossoff and Warnock, they were elected, right? Democrats, as a result of that, they got control of the Senate. They snatched it from the hands of the turtle, and they said, we're in this beat, right? Like, they totally did a gangster move, but they did exactly that. They did a gangster move. In January, on the 14th of January, prior to actually being inaugurated, then President-elect Biden, He announced his $1.9 trillion stimulus package, the American Rescue Plan, right? Which is the focus of our 5-part series. That's what the heck we're talking about at this moment. He talked about that, and in his talking about that, he said that it would include $1,400 checks, not $2,000 checks. Now, to be fair, because I'm all about being fair, maybe not so much for COVID in chief, but I do want to be fair to President Biden here. The argument that he and some of his supporters, or those who support this number, the argument that's being made from their side is that the check is a result of $600 that you got in December plus this $1,400 amount, and that's what's going to give you $2,000. But here's the deal. In the words of President Biden, many people, most Americans, including those who delivered on their promise to help the Democrats pull that gangster move, they were under the impression that their COVID relief check, the one that they'd be getting issued under President Biden, not the two that were completely detached from the two that had to do with Trump. Remember the CARES and then the Consolidated Appropriations Act. They were under the impression that when they got that deposit, when they got their check, that it would be for an even amount of $2,000. So for this reason, a lot of people say President Biden has not hit the ground running on COVID. From an economic standpoint, we'll give him all the credit in the world when it comes to his serious efforts and progress on health and actually listening to scientists and doing a lot to deal with the debacle that was left in regards to the vaccine distribution strategy or lack thereof from the Trump administration. He's done so much of that, but that does not take away from the gangster move that was done against the American people on the economic front of the COVID-19 pandemic. So no, President Biden, for a lot of Americans, based on what we were told before, he did not hit the ground completely. He didn't hit the ground running when it comes to COVID.